Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with James Lancaster, Managing Director of Alderney Electricity, which we often know as AEL. James is going to update us on current matters, and then we'll take a look at future energy options. Right. Morning, James. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Tony. Yeah, just grand.
Okay, can we start off by looking at AEL and possible tariff reform?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Right, at the moment we have a number of different tariffs. The main ones that people are interested in is the tariff A, which is the pay-as-you-go tariff, and tariff C, which is the tariff that also includes a standing charge. And as you and I have discussed on many occasions, though not with video, usually it was when we were on the radio chatting to one another, so the good listeners didn't have to actually stare at our ugly mugs. Then we discussed the fact that actually, because the way the tariffs are structured, there is a flex point where if you are permanently resident on the island, you're better off on tariff C. If your property is only occasionally occupied, you're better off on tariff A. And then there's a flex point between the two. So what that tends to mean is you end up with all the kind of second owners, empty properties or otherwise on tariff A, and all the local residents on tariff C. And we have been in discussion with the states about whether or not we should be changing tariffs. We should look at different ways of charging for energy, whether the system that we've got currently is fair or otherwise. That question is still one of debate and still really reliant upon states' energy policy. I'm guessing at some point we might come back to that during this conversation.
I had it planned.
I think the one thing that I should say is that at some point, I'm going to say within the next 2 to 3 weeks, we will be making an announcement that we are introducing a new tariff, which is tariff T, as we're calling it, T for transition.
Right.
And this is a tariff which is being introduced in the first instance alongside the electrical heating tariff. And the purpose of the transition tariff is to provide a better rate of energy, better price to encourage, what should we say, desirable behaviours. So that T tariff will be available for electric vehicles, for example, and for electrical heating.
Okay, that's interesting because Guernsey are currently promoting electric central heating in a big way.
Yeah.
But my understanding, of course, is that the states make the decisions because you are controlled by a law, aren't you?
Yeah. It's an odd one. So the concession, there is a single tariff in the concession law. So the concession law describes a tariff, and therefore that's the one that we have to have because it's the one that is legally there. Outside of that, in theory, we can introduce any tariff we want as long as it is not, I suppose, of detriment to the users of that tariff.
Okay, so
the rate.
You're not restricted then. You have a lot of flexibility within your current modus operandi in terms of deciding how to set up new tariffs.
Yeah, exactly so. Yeah. So, but I think where we are is to say, all right, well, if these things are not enshrined in law, then by having those tariffs, there needs to be a demonstrable advantage to certain members of the community or otherwise. So tariff C, the one with the standing charge, is not described in the concession law, but of course, nobody minds that because the people on tariff C are better off on tariff C.
Yeah. But there is an argument going around, James, that possibly we should think in terms of higher standing charges and lower unit prices, which for somebody that was there all the time would sort of even out. How do you feel about
that? So if we leave the politics aside for 1 second on that, because there is politics wrapped in all of these kinds of decisions. One of the issues that we've got with the a tariff in particular, though actually with both tariffs as they are structured at the moment, is that we do not recover the company's fixed costs through the standing charge. What that means is that even with the standing charge, whatever the remaining tariff is, there is a variable element in that. And the knock-on effect, therefore, is that if we were to introduce other behaviours, so solar panels on roofs, things like that, you end up with actually a sort of socio-economic change, because the more of the fixed charge or the fixed charges then fall back onto, for example, tariff C owners.
Yeah.
Whereas if we actually moved to a harmonized tariff where we effectively said, okay, the standard, we can clearly say what the company's fixed costs and variable costs are. If we were to reduce, if we were to introduce a tariff whereby all of our fixed costs were recovered through a standing charge, so you pay that regardless, it's effectively a charge for the connection.
Yeah.
And then the variable element of that was simply related to the number of units that you used. So which actually pretty much equates to you just pay us for the diesel that we burn in order to generate your electricity to you. Then actually all things become possible. Because if the island starts using less energy, yeah, okay, we don't get as much money back from the variable element. We don't care about that because we're not burning as much diesel. We still have our fixed costs covered, and therefore the viability of the network stops being consumption dependent.
Yeah.
And it means that everybody on the island is contributing fairly and equally to having that infrastructure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, can you give us an update on the Simec Atlantis proposition, how that's faring at the moment?
Okay, yeah, there has been discussion of this on Ireland, I know, over the last couple of months or so, and I think it sort of got raised up to states at one point. So there are two elements to this, really. The first is there likely to be any fallout for Simec Atlantis Energy from the green cell issue, problem, call it what you will. The collapse, I suppose, is probably a better way of putting it, because, you know, Gupta family group, who have been, you know, one of the organisations intimately wrapped up with the situation around Lex Greensill, are 42%, I think 42% stakeholders in Simec Atlantis Energy.
Oh,
and of course we are yet to hear whether there is going to be any fallout from that. Now, in theory, you say, well, maybe not, because all they are is a minority shareholder who suddenly finds themselves, let's say, you know, impecunious, for example. My understanding is that whilst GFG acquired the shares in Simec Atlantis are not reliant upon GFG for funding.
Yeah.
And therefore one say, well, okay, you know, if you're not actually reliant upon them, it doesn't really matter what happens to your shareholders. So if they were bankrolling Simec Atlantis Energy, that would be a very, very different matter. But Simec Atlantis Energy are simply, they're a technology company bringing propositions to market. So each time they have a proposition, they go out and raise funds for it.
Yeah.
You know, it is not, therefore, I think, you know, there have been sort of some people sort of looking at this with sort of dread and woe and saying, oh, heavens, Greensill have gone, GFG are in problems, Simec Atlantis has a short future. You can't actually link those two, not directly.
Is the French central government still involved?
Well, this comes on to, so ignoring that, we've talked about, you know, GFG and then so moving on to the project generally. I think, again, your regular viewers, listeners, or whatever will know that we discussed the issues around the economics of this project, and that right from you know, the earliest discussions, it has been recognised that making this project work economically for the participants, so Alderney, Simec Atlantis, Normandy government, and all the other people involved in this is challenging. And over the last last 18 months, 2 years or so, we have been working hard to look at how we make the numbers work in our favour. Okay, but I'm still struggling to do that. Now, what has happened is the French government have announced at the back end of last year that there would be a new regime of funding support for renewable energy projects. All right. And tidal falls within this. The actual details of the regime are not likely to be released until back end of this year. So that's the point where we discover whether or not Simec Atlantis have any enhanced funding from the French government in the form of feed-in tariffs or whatever mechanisms they have, in order to then improve the economics of that project. Now, from where I sit, in an ideal world, actually, and it's this one's a bit counterintuitive. In an ideal world, the new funding regime from the French government would mean that the trial array off Cap de la Hague is now economically viable independently, so without any involvement of Alderney. So the reason it's counterintuitive is the instinctive reaction is to say, well, that means they don't need us, does it? So we lose our cable connection at that point. Actually, if anything, the conversation becomes easier because we simply say, look, guys, actually, while you've got all of these ships, cable laying ships and other ships out there, how much is it actually going to cost to run an extension to the infrastructure and bring a cable over to Alderney? How much do we have to pay you per annum as a management fee for that cable? Slight digression here. Nowadays, the subsea cable industry is mature. And so all of the services, all of the other parties, all of the funding, all of the support infrastructures are in place for that. And what you do now if you run a subsea cable is you essentially take out an insurance policy on it. And so if there is a fault, one of the specialist companies that deals with subsea cables gets paid out from your insurance company and comes over and repairs the fault, and off you go again. And that is why you would end up paying a management fee really to cover that insurance policy going forward. So who you pay it to, I don't know, but let's just assume that would go to Simec Atlantis because they're covering the whole of the infrastructure. At which point we may find ourselves in the position where actually it's now looking quite good because we've covered all the costs of the cable, everybody's happy, and that just leaves us to buy whatever electricity we need directly from the French grid at whatever price. And so it then simply becomes a question of, well, actually, can we afford it? So,
and that's always been your problem, hasn't it? What the strike price should be.
Always.
So I mean,
always what the strike. But potentially, we now move away from a strike price if we are simply talking about buying some infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can then potentially fund that commercially. So again, we can talk numbers here. I've said before that I think the incremental cost of including Alderney, what's the extra cost of including Alderney, is going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 million quid.
Yeah.
Sat around waiting for Atlantis to actually stick some numbers behind that, but they don't wince when they say that. So I assume that's kind of where we are. Now that sounds an awful lot of money, doesn't it? But over the 25-year lifetime of the cable, we're talking half £500,000 a year. For access to cheaper electricity with enough headroom to potentially meet Alderney's future energy requirements. Well, actually, the equation may work.
Yeah.
That it's whilst it sounds like a lot of money over the lifetime and considering the potential futures, that may be a figure that is actually supportable. And that's why I say it just becomes an actually much easier question. Yeah.
So you're tending to take the view that you'll let the situation develop and sort of look at it perhaps at the end of the year to see whether the cable only option is viable. Yeah,
exactly so, because the outcome of this could skew the economics massively. What we said to Simon is that there's no point really in continuing the discussion at this stage because the game is about to change completely. Therefore, let's park it. Let's come back to it at the end of the year when you have when we actually know what's going on here. And in the meantime, let's park the heads of terms, because actually the heads of terms that we drew up was drawn up in the context of a very different scenario.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And of course, it wasn't a contract. It was an agreement to proceed. So from your point of view, you can walk away from it and you can modify it.
Yeah, there's nothing legally binding in the heads of terms. It was just, as you say, the heads of terms is simply a recognition that we've done enough work on both sides that it's actually worth putting some more effort into it.
Yeah. Looking at the energy situation in general, the UK is aiming for a 78% reduction in the sort of amount of carbon being chucked out based on 1990 figures. They want to hit that by 2035. And it is to include aviation and marine. So it is pretty urgent, isn't it? It's not that far off.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
So with that in mind, perhaps we could look at a few energy options. But first of all, can I just, in terms of energy policy, can we just confirm that it's the states of Alderney's role to come up with the policy and you as the utility to try and implement it? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, the government, yes, absolutely correct. So short answer to that is yes, absolutely. The point being that the government, whether it's Alderney or any other government, is the elected body which has responsibility for ensuring the future of that community. And energy is one of the big challenges out there. And how we choose to deal with energy going forward, well, there are lots of different issues out there that need to be contended with, lots of choices, but there is no clear path through, and that will all depend upon the circumstances which we are faced, what the objectives of the community are, for example, what are we trying to achieve, what is the standard of living that you're trying to maintain. All of these sorts of things are in the mix, and that is a function of government, not of a utility company. So when we have that umbrella policy which says, so let's put, the threat to extreme, all the things might be considered, and the policy coming from government might be, do you know what, we don't care, let's just keep burning diesel for as long as it's still there. At which point the utility company's job becomes very, very easy, because we say, well, that's fine, we're set up for that, so we'll just carry on as usual. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now I use that extreme because that is not going to be the policy. Companies don't be very, very surprised if it is, but it is ultimately down to the government to say, actually, we wish to reduce our carbon footprint by 78% by 2035. At which point, that feeds straight back into the energy equation, and then at which point the utility company, if you like, is the one that carries the challenge forward of actually working with the community to actually deliver that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I choose my words very carefully there,
well, it is a political decision, and one hopes, and these are not your words, these are mine words, that they will realise that they've got to get something underway pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it's that umbrella in which we operate, which is in part formed by the concession law. In fact, that's all that's there at the moment. But we've got to remember the concession law was written in 1953, addressing a very different set of circumstances than the one we're in at the moment.
Just out the age of steam at that point. Well, interestingly, I saw a programme not so long ago about Fair Isle. It's the most isolated island, as you know. Population actually is 65 people. But it's now got a 24-hour supply consisting of solar, wind and batteries. It costs $3.5 million to put that scheme into. So it is quite large money we're talking about all the way through in terms of change, isn't it?
Yeah, no, totally. It's some of these numbers that the community need to get their head around, really. And I'm pleased to say, actually, there are a number of groups sort of forming within the community who have sort of realised that actually they need to know more about some of these issues.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting quite a lot of requests for information, which we're of course very, very happy to provide, because I think the better educated the community can become about this, the better. But yeah, I mean, I remember when I really started getting involved with renewable energy. How was it? Seriously involved with renewable energy. That was about 20 years ago. And the island of Egg, EIGG, however you pronounce it.
Yeah.
Caught a lot of column inches at the time because they had gone entirely renewable with wind and storage. But at the time you were talking, I think, 27 crofters on Egg, and it's a very, very different challenge. And whilst it was nonetheless a breakthrough project, it was at such a scale that somebody was just happy to pay for it, which is what happened. But the point being that a couple of wind turbines and a pile of car batteries, which is effectively what they were at the time, I think, is not a scalable proposition for an island the size of Alderney.
No.
And so whichever way we look at it, if you were to remove fossil fuels or any fuels from the equation, actually, let's not just say fossil fuels, because by going to biofuels is also an opportunity to reduce that carbon loading of the island. But if you were to go to, let's say, wind, solar, wave, tidal, whatever it is, so those almost cyclic energy sources which need to be backed up by storage, it's going to be expensive.
Yeah. What is our power requirement in terms of to include provision for heating and electric vehicles? Obviously substantially higher than it is at the moment.
Well, yeah. So in round figures, the island consumes about 6 gigawatt hours of, so 6 million units of electricity. Just remember 6.
Yeah.
Each year.
Yeah.
We use about 20 million units of energy for heating properties, and we use, what's the number now? 55 million, about a third, so about 2 million units for transport.
Yeah.
So in round terms, energy use, electricity uses on the island is only a quarter of the island's total energy usage, thereabouts. So, as I have said to people, it's very easy to get fixated with the electricity grid and electricity consumption and all of it. But actually, for the island, the big elephant in the room is heating.
Yeah.
And the reality is that, there is nothing which is going to allow, that I am aware of, that is going to allow us to make that transition from kerosene or fuel-based heating to electrical heating in the short term. There's nothing out there that we can say, all right, we're just going to, even if we just threw money at it, there's nothing well, actually, that's not strictly true. You could do it if you threw money at it, but the amount of money that we're talking about at this point is now astronomical. So really, that transition is something that we would be looking at to deliver over a 10, 20-year period. Yeah. It's of that order. And over that period, there is still layered into that the hope and expectation that new technologies will come along which will help us in this journey. Yeah.
But it's still looking for fusion.
Yeah, well, precisely. We're still looking for nuclear fusion. But if we were to go all electric, it's not just about changing people's boilers for kerosene boilers for heat pumps or electric or modern electric boilers or other advanced forms of heating, because we still need to move that much energy around, electricity around the island. And there are parts on the grid where the grid just wouldn't cope. Yeah. And so we are talking about a long-term program of investment to transition from the state we're in at the moment to some future state, which at the moment remains partially unknown.
Yeah. Do you coming back to the cable aspect?
Yep.
Do you think possibly a partnership with Guernsey on this one to avoid the sort of situation that's happened with Jersey recently? Because obviously the Guernsey feed comes from Jersey. Now, if they sent it via us and we tapped in, that would mean that they wouldn't be quite so dependent upon Jersey politically having upsets with the French fishermen and the like.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So yes, so Jersey end up having a punch up the French fishermen over access rights to Jersey's waters, and there, a threat is issued to turn the power off. Okay, fine, bit of saber rattling. I think there's a bit more to turning the power off than was implied in the comment. It's not as if they can just throw the switch. There are legal issues and all sorts of things that would need to be dealt with. However, let's say they did it. In amongst that, you're right. Of course, what's easy to forget is that the cable goes to Jersey, but then it carries on going to Guernsey. So that affects both of the big islands quite significantly. And energy security is a huge, huge issue for everyone. Now, could they bring a cable down, over to Alderney and then down to Guernsey or something like that, or take a separate cable to Guernsey? Well, it doesn't really get you past the politics, does it?
No.
At the back of my mind, the reality exists that if we were to bring a cable from France via the tidal array, well, there is still a bit of French territorial water that we would need to cross with the Alderney cable before it gets to Alderney waters. So who knows? I mean, in amongst that, there may be a political discussion, of that nature, which is about, well, actually, what are the French asking for in order to allow us to cross that bit of their territorial water?
Is there much difference in terms of mileage, in terms of distance between a direct one from France to Guernsey following the Jersey route, or a direct one from France to Guernsey via Alderney, as it were?
I mean, without sitting down with the map in front of me, order of magnitude,
I don't think there's much in it.
The order of magnitude, they're much the same. So if you were, for example, so Guernsey have the GF1 project, which is, it's on the drawing board. That's Guernsey, the cable running from Guernsey to France directly. My understanding is that if that cable were to go ahead, it wouldn't go down to sort of Carteret, which is where I think the existing connections are. I think it would head up towards Flamanville. Yeah. Now, Guernsey to Flamanville and Guernsey to Alderney to Joburg is probably not dissimilar in terms of distance. The other issues you've got to ask, however, is, well, what's at the other end of the cable? And at the moment, Alderney is what we are talking about with the Atlantis array is connecting into the subgrid, the medium voltage grid, which is run by Enedis, but there isn't enough power on that grid for Guernsey's requirements. Because it runs at a much lower voltage. So if Guernsey were to take a cable to France, they would need to access the EDF. Well, actually, no, it's not the EDF. It's what are they called? Sorry, my brain's gone. Basically, the French national grid. Yeah. In order to access that high voltage infrastructure. And my understanding is that has all been improved up the Cherbourg Peninsula, certainly as far as Flamanville, because of the expected arrival of the new nuclear power stations there.
Yeah, and that is high voltage AC, is it?
That's what high voltage AC.
Yeah.
But, how you know the distance we're talking about, that they would. There isn't a suggestion that the GF1 cable or otherwise is going to run DC. It would just run AC over those sorts of distances. Okay. But in which case, if you had to pick up the cable down at Flamanville just to get the right level of supply for Guernsey, well, Alderney's out of the equation at that point anyway.
Sure. Yeah. So what else have we got? Solar, wind, tidal, geothermal, pump storage. There are lots of lots of things, aren't there, that could happen, but they all need a vast amount of money to make them happen.
Yeah, we did mention hydrogen in there, Tony. Hydrogen.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah,
I've always liked hydrogen. In fact, I thought for many years I thought that hydrogen was going to bypass a lot of the direct electrical technology. So electric vehicles, I thought actually hydrogen vehicles are going to leapfrog battery powered electric vehicles. Of course, I'm totally wrong about that. Because whilst the technology is there, it hasn't attracted the kind of levels of investment and interest to actually bring it to maturity. I personally still think that hydrogen is long-term future, but it will require a huge amount of investment, far more than Alderney will can put into that. So if we went to a hydrogen economy, then you are, as ever, piggybacking off the activities of large nations. And hoping that the infrastructure, the scale of the infrastructure cascades down to a level where it would be applicable to more remote communities, whether at the scale of Jersey, Guernsey or Alderney.
In support of the hydrogen theory, very interesting to note that Lord Bamford, head of JCB, is developing a hydrogen-powered digger, not a fuel cell, an actual stick it into the engine and fire it up situation.
Yeah. No, absolutely right. Engines will run quite happily off gas.
Yeah.
Of all sorts of different varieties. I mean, the new engines which we have in at the power station will run on biogas.
Right.
Now, off the top of my head, I can't remember whether we can modify them to run off of hydrogen, but hydrogen wasn't really an option when we were thinking about it, and it still isn't really. But biogas, methane, is certainly an option. And so the engines were chosen specifically just in case the availability of biogas became such that it became a more viable option than diesel. And of course, from a carbon footprint point of view, that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
So the engines as they stand will run up to, it's funny, I've just been having this conversation in the last 48 hours. The engines as they stand will run on a mix of 70% biogas, 30% diesel without modification, or with only very minor modification to some of the sensors and the control system. They will run on 100% biogas, but you're talking quite significant modifications to the engines to deliver that, but not not prohibitively expensive. A whole new engine costs, well, we actually just bought a couple so that we've actually got spare engines available.
Yeah.
They're about, let's say 50 grand each, something like that.
Yeah.
So, if you've got to modify them, well, it's not huge.
Get a lot of engines for the £3.5 million spent on Fair Isle.
Correct. You get an awful lot of diesel engines. but Tony, that's part of the problem. What we forget is that diesel, fossil fuels are nature's energy storage.
Yeah.
Thing. We think of diesel as something different from a battery, but it's not. It's actually just a different type of battery. It's a liquid battery, which you can then, by burning it or otherwise, you can then get the energy out of it.
Yeah.
What we unfortunately don't have is the several billion years that it takes
to create it.
To turn primordial forests into black gold.
Well, I think this is the point where we sort of say, well, I think, until we come up with an idea that will fit that bill. Well, James, as ever, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for sparing us some time. Speak later on in the year to see how things are getting along. And
absolutely. Right.
Hope you and Sandy are both okay.
Yeah, very well. Thank you very much.
I mean, might even see
over here
a live guest appearance from you someday.
Well, I'm very much hoping that the restrictions. I've had my first vaccination. I got my second vaccination in the middle of June. Lateral flow tests are easily available over here, so I'm hoping that actually, my plan is as soon as the travel restrictions lift to a level where it's not requiring extensive self-isolation, then I'll hop on the first plane and come out there. So I'm expecting to be out there in July at this moment.
Well, that's good.
So hopefully we'll see you then, and perhaps if there's some news or something else we want to talk about.
Yeah, we can have another go. So many thanks. Take care. Bye for now.
You look after yourself.
Thank you.
Cheers, Tony. Bye now.